Captain Jake Morrison stared at the classified folder on his desk. 3 thin files that represented career-ending nightmares disguised as routine paperwork. The Pentagon had a way of burying uncomfortable truths behind bureaucratic language, and these reports reeked of official sanitization. 3 separate incidents across the globe, all involving military personnel, all resulting in casualties, and all officially explained away with the kind of bland terminology that made Morrison's skin crawl. His new assignment was simple on paper: investigate, interview survivors, file reports. But 20 years in military intelligence had taught him to read between lines, and what he saw in these files suggested something far darker than training accidents or equipment failures. The brass wanted answers, but Morrison suspected they already knew more than they were telling him. His small team would be diving into situations that had already destroyed other soldiers' lives, and he had the sinking feeling they might not come back unchanged. Sergeant Kim sat across from Morrison's desk, her sharp intelligence analyst instincts already picking apart the inconsistencies in their briefing materials. At 32, she'd seen enough Black Ops reports to know when something stank of cover-up, and these files practically screamed classified horror. Corporal Hayes, their communications specialist, reviewed the technical aspects of their assignment with the methodical precision that had made him invaluable in 3 previous deployments. Private Chen, barely 25 but gifted with an eye for detail that bordered on supernatural, would be documenting everything they found with camera equipment and recording devices that could capture evidence even skeptical superiors couldn't dismiss. Morrison watched his team absorb the implications of their mission, seeing the same unease in their faces that he felt in his gut. They were being sent to investigate things that officially didn't exist, to interview survivors of incidents that had never happened, and to file reports that would probably disappear into classified vaults before the ink dried. The site, 3 locations painted a picture of global strangeness that made Morrison's military mind rebel against the implications. Romania, Afghanistan, Pacific Ocean. 3 completely different environments, 3 separate military operations, but all sharing the same elements of inexplicable tragedy and survivor trauma. Each incident had left behind shattered soldiers, who'd requested immediate transfers and refused to discuss details beyond their official statements. Equipment had been abandoned, positions evacuated, and entire operations quietly shut down without explanation. Morrison's orders came directly from levels of command that didn't usually concern themselves with individual unit problems, suggesting these incidents had attracted attention from people who dealt with threats to national security rather than routine military mishaps. As his team prepared for their first interview, Morrison couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into something that would test more than their professional capabilities. The survivors they'd be interviewing had all been changed by their experiences, and Morrison wondered what changes awaited his own team as they delved into mysteries that the military preferred to keep buried. Sergeant Mike Davis sat in the sterile interview room like a man who'd been hollowed out from the inside, his eyes carrying the weight of horrors that military debriefing couldn't exorcise. Morrison had interviewed hundreds of combat veterans over his career, but Davis possessed a particular quality of trauma that set Morrison's teeth on edge. The look of someone who'd encountered something that challenged his understanding of reality itself. The official report listed Davis as the sole survivor of a border observation incident that killed 3 soldiers through simultaneous cardiac arrest, but Davis's hands shook with the tremor of someone fighting to maintain sanity rather than mourning fallen comrades. When Morrison asked him to describe the final night at the Romanian observation post, Davis's voice dropped to a whisper that barely carried across the small table between them. He spoke of sounds that came from the forest surrounding their position, sounds that had no business existing in the natural world, but that had called to them with voices like children singing lullabies in languages that predated human civilization. The 4-man team had been conducting routine border surveillance when the incidents began, monitoring radio traffic and tracking movement patterns along smuggling routes that connected Romania to its eastern neighbors. Davis described the first few nights as completely normal. Standard military routine, regular check-ins with command, Nothing more threatening than occasional wildlife moving through the forest around their concealed observation post. But on the fourth night, something changed in the woods surrounding their position. The normal sounds of nocturnal forest life simply stopped, leaving behind a silence so complete it felt like physical pressure against their eardrums. Then came the singing. Voices that sounded like children calling from deep within the trees. Melodies that were beautiful and terrible simultaneously. Words in a language that none of them recognized, but that somehow conveyed meaning directly to parts of their minds that existed below conscious thought. Davis's teammates had initially dismissed the sounds as audio hallucinations caused by stress and isolation. But as the singing continued night after night, growing closer to their position, all four men began experiencing shared dreams of walking into the forest to join whatever was calling to them from the darkness. Davis's account of finding his three teammates dead created a picture that medical examiners couldn't explain, and that Davis himself struggled to articulate without breaking down completely. He'd awakened from dreams of forest voices to find the observation post quiet. His teammates slumped at their monitoring stations with expressions of absolute terror frozen on their faces. No signs of struggle, no evidence of external attack, no wounds or trauma that could account for their deaths. Just three healthy soldiers who had apparently died of fear so intense it stopped their hearts simultaneously. Davis had checked their equipment and found everything functioning normally. Their weapons unfired, their defensive positions intact, but the terror on their faces told a story that contradicted every rational explanation for what had occurred during those final moments. Davis admitted that he should have died with them, that something had spared him for reasons he couldn't understand, leaving him to carry the memory of their expressions, and the knowledge that the singing from the forest had finally gotten what it wanted. Since the incident, Davis reported recurring nightmares where his dead teammates called to him from the Romanian woods, their voices joining the children's choir that had taken their lives, begging him to return and complete what had been started in that observation post. Morrison's team arrived at the Romanian observation post, expecting to find evidence of conventional military mishap. But the site immediately challenged every assumption their training had provided about combat casualties and operational security. The structure itself was intact and showed no signs of battle damage, equipment failure, or external assault. Yet the psychological atmosphere was so oppressive that Chen started photographing everything within minutes of their arrival, as if documenting evidence before something could make it disappear. Local Romanian forces had provided escort to the site, but refused to remain after delivering Morrison's team, citing operational commitments that were obviously excuses to avoid spending time in an area that had acquired a reputation for inexplicable tragedy. The observation post sat in a clearing surrounded by ancient forest that seemed to press against the military installation with malevolent intent. Trees that were old when human civilization was young, and that watched their activities with the patient attention of predators evaluating potential prey. Morrison's immediate instinct was to complete their investigation quickly and evacuate. But professional duty required thorough examination of a site that had already claimed 3 lives and potentially threatened others. Chen's photography and documentation revealed details that military investigators had either missed or chosen not to report in their official findings. The windows of the observation post showed scratches that appeared to have been made from outside, marks that suggested something had been testing the glass strength with claws or tools, while the occupants watched helplessly from within. Kim's analysis of the surveillance equipment found that most recordings from the final night had been corrupted by interference that didn't match any known electronic jamming techniques. But fragments of audio remained that captured the singing Davis had described. The voices were clearly audible through static, children's voices singing in harmonies that human vocal cords couldn't produce, melodies that made Morrison's team unconsciously lean away from the speakers, as if the sounds carried physical threat. Hayes attempted to clean up the audio recordings using sophisticated filtering equipment, but each enhancement seemed to make the voices more disturbing rather than clearer, revealing undertones and harmonics that suggested the singers possessed anatomy unlike anything in conventional biology textbooks. The psychological impact of the sight became apparent within hours of their arrival, as Morrison's team began experiencing effects that mirrored Davis's descriptions of the original incident. Kim reported hearing faint singing from the forest that grew louder whenever she stopped concentrating on her analytical work. Voices that seemed to know her name and called to her with personal familiarity that made her skin crawl. Hayes found that his communication equipment picked up transmissions that weren't coming from any identifiable source. Radio chatter in the same unknown language captured in the corrupted surveillance recordings. Conversations that seemed to respond to his presence by incorporating details about his personal history that no outside observer should have known. Chen's documentation work became increasingly frantic as shadows in his photographs appeared to move between shots. Forest shapes that rearranged themselves when he wasn't looking directly at them, but that created patterns suggesting intelligence and deliberate positioning. Morrison realized that whatever had killed the original observation team was still present in the forest, still singing its deadly lullabies, and now focused its attention on new victims who had walked willingly into its hunting ground. As evening approached and the singing grew louder, Morrison made the tactical decision to evacuate immediately, understanding that staying overnight would likely add 4 more names to the casualty list of an incident that officially didn't exist. Corporal Tony Williams sat across from Morrison's interview table like a man, balanced on the edge of a psychological cliff, his military bearing barely containing trauma that had shattered something fundamental in his understanding of human nature and the reliability of military brotherhood. The official report described Williams as the sole survivor of a cave clearing operation that resulted in 7 combat casualties through friendly fire incidents and operational confusion. But Morrison could see in Williams's eyes the kind of horror that came from watching trusted comrades transform into something unrecognizable and deadly. When Morrison asked him to describe what had happened in the Afghan cave system, Williams's voice took on the flat, emotionless tone of someone recounting experiences too terrible for normal emotional processing. He spoke of an 8-man team entering caves that were rumored to contain Taliban weapon caches, but instead finding something that turned professional soldiers into murderous strangers who attacked each other with the savage intensity of wild animals fighting over territory. Williams described the cave operation as routine until they penetrated deeper into the mountain than their intelligence had suggested would be necessary, following passages that seemed to extend far beyond what geological surveys indicated was possible for the local rock formations. The team had been moving through narrow tunnels using standard tactical procedures when they began hearing whispers that seemed to come from the stone walls themselves, voices speaking in languages that predated human settlement in the region, but that somehow conveyed meaning directly to parts of their minds that governed aggression and territorial instinct. Initially, the whispers were barely audible and easily dismissed as wind moving through rock formations. But as the team moved deeper into the cave system, the voices grew stronger and more insistent, speaking words that made normally disciplined soldiers begin questioning each other's loyalty and competence. Williams watched his teammates' behavior change gradually from professional military cooperation to suspicious hostility, each man becoming convinced that his comrades were planning to betray him and that violence was the only solution to threats that existed only in their increasingly paranoid minds. The transformation of Williams's team from professional soldiers into homicidal enemies created a nightmare of close-quarters combat that violated every principle of military training and unit cohesion. Men who had saved each other's lives in previous deployments began attacking their squad mates with weapons and improvised tools, fighting with savage intensity that suggested complete loss of rational thought and human compassion. Williams described hiding in cave formations while his teammates hunted each other through passages that echoed with screams and gunfire, listening to voices he'd known for years distorted by rage and fear that turned familiar speech patterns into something barely recognizable as human communication. The whispers from the cave walls grew stronger as violence increased, as if feeding on the aggression and terror that consumed his unit, encouraging more brutal behavior through suggestions that bypassed conscious thought and spoke directly to primitive brain centers. that governed survival instinct and territorial violence. Williams survived by remaining hidden until the sounds of combat ended and silence returned to the caves, then crawling through passages littered with the bodies of men who had killed each other over imagined threats that the cave whispers had planted in their minds. He emerged from the mountain as the only witness to a massacre that had no explanation in military doctrine or medical literature, carrying knowledge of how trusted brotherhood could be, transformed into deadly hatred through methods that challenged everything humans understood about psychology and group dynamics. Morrison's team entered the Afghan cave system, with local guides who spoke in hushed tones about the madness caves that had been claiming victims for generations before American forces ever set foot in the region. The guides agreed to escort them to the entrance but refused to venture deeper than the outer chambers, citing tribal knowledge about passages that stole men's souls and turned brothers into enemies through whispers that spoke in voices older than human memory. Morrison noted that these weren't superstitious peasants, but experienced mountain fighters who had survived decades of warfare without showing fear of conventional military threats. Yet something about these particular caves inspired terror that transcended cultural and linguistic barriers. The entrance itself seemed ordinary enough, a natural opening in the mountainside that showed signs of recent military activity, but the psychological atmosphere changed dramatically as they moved beyond the reach of sunlight and entered passages where Williams' team had encountered their fate. Kim's intelligence analysis of the cave system revealed architectural features that didn't match geological surveys or known formation processes, passages that followed patterns suggesting deliberate construction by intelligence that understood principles of acoustic engineering and psychological manipulation. The whispers Williams had described became audible within the first 100 meters of cave exploration, voices that seemed to emanate from the rock walls themselves, and that spoke in frequencies designed to bypass conscious hearing and affect brain centers responsible for aggression and paranoia. Hayes documented the acoustic properties using sophisticated recording equipment that captured sounds his human ears couldn't detect, discovering that the cave walls produced subsonic vibrations that could influence emotional states and decision-making processes through purely physical means. Chen's photography revealed scratch marks and bloodstains that told the story of Williams's team's final hours, evidence of close-quarters combat between soldiers who had turned on each other with the fury of mortal enemies rather than the reluctance of comrades forced into conflict. The psychological effects of the cave whispers became apparent within 30 minutes of deep cave exploration, as Morrison's team began experiencing the same paranoid hostility that had destroyed Williams's unit. Kim started questioning Morrison's tactical decisions with increasing hostility, suggesting that he was deliberately leading them into danger for reasons that served interests other than mission completion. Hayes became convinced that Chen was documenting their activities for purposes beyond official reporting, scrutinizing the photographer's work with suspicious intensity that bordered on aggression. Morrison realized that the cave environment was systematically undermining their unit cohesion through psychological manipulation that operated below the level of conscious awareness, making each team member perceive threats from his trusted colleagues, while providing rational-sounding justifications for increasingly irrational behavior. When Hayes drew his sidearm and accused Chen of being an enemy infiltrator, Morrison ordered immediate evacuation, understanding that remaining in the caves would result in his team duplicating the tragedy that had consumed Williams's unit. As they retreated toward sunlight and fresh air, the whispers grew louder and more insistent, as if angry at being denied new victims for the madness that had been claiming soldiers in these passages for far longer than American military presence in Afghanistan. Private Luis Torres sat in the interview room with the 1,000-yard stare of someone who had witnessed impossible things and survived through luck rather than skill or training. His nervous system apparently rewired by experiences that left him jumping at sounds that didn't exist and flinching from lights that weren't there. The official report described Torres as the sole survivor of a mass personnel incident at an isolated Pacific radar station where 12 soldiers had vanished overnight, leaving behind only Torres unconscious on the beach with no memory of the final night and no explanation for his comrades' disappearance. Morrison could see that Torres was fighting to maintain sanity, while processing memories that challenged his understanding of reality, struggling to describe experiences that his mind had partially suppressed as psychological self-defense against trauma, too severe for normal processing. When Morrison asked him to recount the events leading up to the mass disappearance, Torres spoke in fragments about his fellow soldiers walking into the ocean at night, following lights that called to them from beneath the waves with voices that promised reunion with people they'd lost to previous deployments and personal tragedies. The radar station had been staffed with a 12-man crew responsible for monitoring air traffic and providing communication relay for military aircraft operating in the vast Pacific theater. Routine duty that should have involved nothing more dangerous than equipment maintenance and weather observation. Torres described the first few weeks of deployment as completely normal, with his team settling into the isolated routine of technical specialists, maintaining sophisticated electronic equipment on an island so remote that supply drops came monthly and emergency evacuation would require days of coordination. But approximately 2 weeks before the incident, personnel began reporting strange lights visible in the water around the island at night, illumination that appeared to come from significant depths and that pulsed with rhythms that seemed to respond to human observation. Initially, the crew assumed they were seeing bioluminescent marine life or underwater volcanic activity, but the lights began appearing closer to shore and displaying patterns that suggested intelligence and deliberate communication rather than natural phenomena. Torres's account of the final night painted a picture of mass hypnosis or psychological manipulation that medical examiners couldn't explain, and that Torres himself struggled to accept as actual memory rather than trauma-induced hallucination. He described awakening to find the radar station empty, his 11 teammates gone from their bunks and duty stations without triggering any alarms or security protocols that should have detected mass personnel movement. Following their tracks, Torres found evidence that his comrades had walked calmly to the beach and into the ocean, leaving behind their uniforms and personal equipment, arranged in neat piles as if they were preparing for swimming rather than disappearing forever into Pacific waters. The lights beneath the waves had been brighter that night, creating illumination patterns that seemed to spell out words and images that spoke directly to whatever psychological vulnerabilities each soldier carried. Promises of reunion with lost loved ones, relief from military service trauma, and peace that could only be found in the depths where the lights originated. Torres remembered standing at the water's edge, feeling the same compulsion that had taken his teammates, hearing voices from the lights that knew intimate details about his family and personal history, while promising solutions to problems he'd never shared with anyone else. His survival came from physical collapse rather than psychological resistance. He'd apparently fainted on the beach and awakened 12 hours later to find himself alone on an island where 12 men had walked into the ocean and never returned. Morrison's team arrived at the abandoned Pacific radar station by military transport that deposited them on an island so isolated that the nearest human settlement was 500 miles away, leaving them completely dependent on scheduled extraction in 3 days. The installation showed signs of hasty abandonment, with equipment left running and personal belongings scattered in patterns that suggested rapid departure rather than organized evacuation. Yet official records indicated that Torres had been the only survivor found when search and rescue teams arrived days after the incident. Local fishermen who had transported Morrison's team from the nearest inhabited island spoke nervously about the calling waters around the radar station, describing the area as cursed by spirits that lured the living into the ocean depths through lights and voices that promised false salvation. Morrison noted that these fishermen were experienced Pacific navigators who had spent their entire lives dealing with dangerous weather and treacherous currents. Yet they showed genuine fear of waters that appeared completely normal during daylight hours and insisted on departing before sunset, despite being offered significant additional payment to remain. Hayes's technical analysis of the radar station's equipment revealed electromagnetic anomalies that didn't correspond to any known natural phenomena or technological interference. readings that suggested the presence of massive energy sources operating beneath the ocean around the island. The station's instruments had recorded data that indicated underwater activity on a scale that should have been impossible to hide from satellite surveillance and oceanographic monitoring systems. Yet official records showed no unusual marine activity in the region during the time period when the 12 soldiers disappeared. Chen's documentation of the site revealed personal belongings arranged in geometric patterns that suggested deliberate placement rather than random abandonment. Military gear and civilian items organized in configurations that hurt to look at directly, and that seemed to shift position when observed through peripheral vision. Kim discovered that the station's communication logs contained messages that had been transmitted and received during hours when no personnel should have been alive to operate the equipment. Radio traffic in which voices matching the missing soldiers discussed their preparations for joining the depths and answering the call that had been sent specifically for them. The psychological effects of the island environment became apparent. As sunset approached and strange lights began appearing in the waters surrounding their position, illumination that seemed to respond to their presence by growing brighter and moving closer to shore. Morrison's team found themselves drawn to observe the lights despite understanding the danger they represented, standing at the water's edge and listening to sounds that seemed to emerge from the depths, voices that knew their names and personal histories while promising relief from military service stress and reunion with people they'd lost to combat casualties and personal tragedies. Kim reported hearing her deceased brother calling from beneath the waves, his voice describing the peace he'd found in the depths and inviting her to join him in a place where military duty and personal pain couldn't reach. Hayes became convinced that his failed marriage could be repaired if he followed the lights to their source, where his ex-wife waited to reconcile and build the family they'd never managed to create during his multiple deployments. Chen started walking toward the water while photographing the lights, claiming he needed to document their source for his official report, but clearly responding to psychological compulsion rather than professional duty. Morrison realized that whatever had taken the original radar station crew was using their own psychological vulnerabilities against them, tailoring its approach to exploit individual weaknesses, while promising solutions that could only be found by walking into the ocean and never returning to the surface. Morrison's team returned from their third investigation changed by experiences that no military training had prepared them to handle, carrying psychological contamination from 3 different sources of horror that seemed to be awakening dormant capabilities for influencing human behavior through supernatural means. Kim continued hearing forest singing from Romania, even while filing reports in their temporary headquarters. Children's voices that called her name during quiet moments and promised peace if she would just walk outside at night and follow their melodies into whatever darkness waited beyond military security. Hayes found that his communication equipment picked up whispers from the Afghan caves, regardless of his location. Voices speaking in languages that predated human civilization, but that conveyed meaning directly to parts of his mind responsible for aggression and paranoia, making him question his teammates' loyalty and Morrison's fitness for command. Chen reported seeing underwater lights in every body of water they encountered, illumination that pulsed with rhythms, matching his heartbeat while showing him images of colleagues who had drowned during their military service and who beckoned him to join them in depths where duty and trauma couldn't follow. The psychological contamination was spreading between team members through mechanisms that Morrison couldn't understand but that threatened to destroy their unit cohesion, just as it had eliminated the soldiers they'd been investigating. Kim's exposure to the Romanian forest voices made her sensitive to sounds that didn't exist, causing her to pause her analytical work to listen for singing that only she could hear, while her facial expressions showed the kind of blissful terror that Davis had described in his interview. Hayes' contact with the Afghan cave whispers left him suspicious of everyone around him, interpreting normal conversation as coded threats and viewing routine military procedures as evidence of conspiracies designed to eliminate him and his knowledge of classified incidents. Jen's encounter with the Pacific Lights made him spend increasing amounts of time staring at reflective surfaces, claiming he was checking his photography equipment, but clearly searching for underwater illumination that promised escape from military service through methods that led only to death by drowning. Morrison realized that their investigation had exposed his team to psychological warfare techniques that operated through supernatural means, transforming them from investigators into victims of the same phenomena that had destroyed the soldiers they'd been sent to study. Each location had infected them with specific forms of madness that seemed designed to eliminate military personnel through methods that left no evidence of external attack. The Romanian forest used beautiful music to lure victims into unknown fates. The Afghan caves turned unit cohesion into mutual destruction, and the Pacific Island used personal psychological vulnerabilities to convince soldiers to commit suicide by drowning. The pattern suggested coordinated assault on military operations through enemies that understood human psychology well enough to exploit individual and group weaknesses while operating through means that conventional military doctrine couldn't address or counter. As Morrison watched his team deteriorate under influences they'd encountered during their investigations, he began to understand that their mission hadn't been fact-finding, but exposure to threats that someone in command wanted tested on expendable personnel. They were becoming case studies in supernatural warfare, guinea pigs in experiments designed to evaluate threats that military leadership needed to understand but couldn't acknowledge officially. Morrison's search through classified military databases revealed files that painted a picture of deliberate exposure and systematic cover-up spanning decades of military operations. Documents that showed his team's investigation had been designed to confirm information that command already possessed, rather than gathering new intelligence about unknown threats. Previous military units had reported identical encounters at the same 3 locations dating back to World War II, with each generation of soldiers discovering the same supernatural threats while believing they were the first to encounter phenomena that had been claiming military lives for decades. The Romanian forest had been eliminating border patrol units since the Cold War. The Afghan caves had been driving Soviet soldiers to mutual destruction during their occupation, and the Pacific Island had been luring American personnel to their death since it was first established as a radar station in the 1950s. Each incident had been officially explained as training accidents, equipment failures, or enemy action, while classified files documented the true causes and their psychological effects on survivors, who were immediately transferred to different units and sworn to secrecy about their experiences. The pattern of deliberate exposure suggested that military leadership was using these locations as testing grounds for evaluating supernatural threats while building a database of information about enemies that couldn't be fought through conventional means. Morrison discovered that his team hadn't been chosen randomly, but had been selected, specifically because their psychological profiles indicated they would be likely to survive initial exposure while providing useful data about how supernatural warfare affected different personality types and military specializations. The files revealed that Kim's analytical intelligence made her valuable for studying the Romanian forest's psychological manipulation techniques. Hayes's communication expertise provided data about how the Afghan caves affected military technology and unit coordination. And Chen's documentation skills offered visual evidence of phenomena that most military personnel couldn't perceive clearly enough to record effectively. Morrison realized that he'd been chosen to lead the investigation because his command experience would help him maintain unit cohesion under supernatural assault, while his intelligence background would enable him to compile comprehensive reports about threats that conventional military training couldn't address. The scope of the conspiracy extended far beyond Morrison's immediate chain of command, reaching into levels of military and civilian leadership that dealt with threats to national security through methods that existed outside public knowledge or congressional oversight. The classified files revealed that similar supernatural locations existed throughout the world, each one monitored and occasionally tested using military personnel who believed they were conducting routine operations rather than serving as expendable research subjects in experiments designed to understand enemies that operated outside the normal rules of warfare. The 3 locations Morrison's team had investigated represented only a small sample of sites where military forces encountered supernatural opposition that couldn't be explained through conventional threat assessment or countered through traditional military responses. The pattern suggested that supernatural warfare was a recognized category of national security threat that required ongoing study and evaluation through methods that sacrificed military personnel to gather intelligence about enemies that couldn't be fought directly, but that continued to pose threats to military operations worldwide. Morrison's team was debriefed by officers whose names didn't appear in any official military database and whose authority seemed to extend beyond normal chain of command restrictions. Men in uniform who spoke with the quiet confidence of people who dealt with threats that existed outside public knowledge or democratic oversight. The debriefing process involved detailed questioning about their psychological experiences at each location, medical examinations that tested for forms of contamination that weren't mentioned in standard military health protocols, and psychological evaluations that seemed designed to determine how much knowledge they could safely retain without compromising their mental stability or military effectiveness. Morrison realized that the debriefing was actually a screening process designed to determine whether his team could be trusted with classified information or whether they would require more permanent solutions to prevent disclosure of supernatural warfare capabilities that enemies were using. Against American military forces, the non-disclosure agreements they were required to sign carried penalties that exceeded normal military discipline, including provisions for imprisonment without trial and methods of enforcement that suggested their signatures were giving consent for elimination if they ever discussed their experiences with unauthorized personnel. Morrison's team was required to submit falsified reports that described their investigation as routine fact-finding about training accidents and equipment failures, while all physical evidence they'd collected was confiscated and classified at levels that would prevent future researchers from accessing information about supernatural threats that continued to claim military lives. Their cameras, recording equipment, and written notes disappeared into filing systems that existed outside normal military records management, while backup copies of their documentation were destroyed through methods that suggested technological capabilities beyond conventional data elimination procedures. The final element of the cover-up involved immediate reassignment of Morrison's team to different units stationed on separate continents, breaking up their shared knowledge while placing them under observation by personnel who would monitor their behavior for signs of psychological breakdown or unauthorized disclosure attempts. Morrison was promoted to a desk job that kept him busy with routine administrative duties while preventing him from accessing information about supernatural warfare or conducting further investigations into incidents that officially didn't exist. Kim, Hayes, and Chen received transfers to positions that utilized their technical skills while isolating them from intelligence work that might remind them of their experiences or enable them to research similar incidents. As Morrison watched his team scattered across the globe, he understood that they'd become permanent security risks who would be monitored for the rest of their careers. Their knowledge too dangerous to eliminate, but too valuable to waste through traditional methods of silencing inconvenient witnesses. The final scene showed Morrison watching television. News reports about military training accidents at remote locations that he recognized as potential supernatural warfare sites, incidents that followed patterns identical to what his team had investigated, but that were being explained through official channels as routine military mishaps. New units were being deployed to the same 3 locations where his team had nearly lost their sanity. Fresh soldiers who would face the same supernatural threats while believing they were conducting routine military operations, rather than serving as test subjects in ongoing experiments. Morrison realized that the cycle was beginning again with new victims who would discover the same horrors his team had encountered, while he remained powerless to warn them about dangers that couldn't be discussed without violating agreements that carried penalties worse than death. The conspiracy would continue claiming military lives through supernatural warfare that operated outside public knowledge, while survivors like Morrison carried the burden of knowing that their silence was enabling ongoing atrocities disguised as military training exercises and routine deployments.